Welcome to the Road to Discovery, a presentation by Ask Resource Center about the secondary transition planning process for students with disabilities. In this session, we will discuss the post-secondary transition process, what it is and why it's important, ways that families can be involved, and most importantly, how to support student participation in this process. First and foremost, I think the most important thing to take away is that this is a process, not just one or two meetings. Secondary transition is a time of huge change and preparation for that change. It means planning individually and meaningfully for living, learning, and working after high school for a young adult with disabilities. A couple of notes before we get started. Throughout this session, the term family will be used. It is intended to include any composition of people who are involved in a young person's life. This could include parents, grandparents, decision makers, or care providers for the student with disabilities. And secondly, it's important to note that the materials covered in this presentation apply to public schools and public charter schools, but not necessarily to private schools. Planning for adult life. We should all be familiar with three areas of adult life that teams consider specifically during secondary transition planning: living, learning, and working. We will discuss each of these areas in greater detail later. For the purposes of this training, we will refer to secondary as those activities that occur during high school. Post-secondary refers to those activities that a student participates in after completing high school. So why is planning important? Let's take a look at a couple factors that makes this secondary transition process so important for the success of students. First of all, it helps students achieve goals and their dreams. It helps them to see and establish high expectations for themselves. And then it allows the IEP teams, family members to support those high expectations and to be open to options. It really is a time of discovery for the youth, a time to ask the students important questions such as, what kind of work do I want to do? What am I interested in? Do I need more education or training for that? Where do I want to live? Those types of real life practical questions are what can really pull the student in and motivate them to be involved in their own process. And lastly, research has shown that transition planning, when families are involved, increases students with disabilities' probability of pursuing some kind of post-secondary learning and attaining meaningful employment. Another answer to the why do we plan question is simply that it's required. Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act, or IDEA, requires that secondary transition planning occurs, and there are three areas in which every IEP team should consider for the student: living, learning, and working. We'll look specifically or more in detail at these later in the presentation. Let's look at the question, when should we start? All secondary students' IEPs must include transition goals. Remember, when we say secondary, that means students that are in high school. In Iowa, the law states that special education secondary transition must begin at age 14. For students receiving special education services in Iowa, the process continues until a student graduates or ages out of school. It's also important to keep in mind that secondary transition planning is not just a school-based activity. We'll talk a little bit later about how and who can be involved and should be involved in this process. The important takeaway here is that it is never too early or too late to begin planning for that important secondary transition. Now let's answer the question, who plans? Who makes up this important secondary transition planning team? The first three on this slide listed, the student, the family, and school personnel, are those that are required under IDEA. A representative from each of those groups must be involved in the team. And there are several other key partners that make the road to a successful transition possible. On the next slide, we'll discuss more options of who those members may be and the roles in more detail. But just as IEP teams in school-aged children, it's important to include those people, professionals, support people who have specific and special knowledge about the student, their disability and its impact, and also the accommodations and supports that have been successful. Let's start out by looking at the star of the show, or the student's role in this important transition planning process. Schools are required to invite students to participate in their IEP meetings whenever secondary transition goals or services are considered. And remember, in Iowa, that begins at least at age 14. For some students, it may be appropriate to involve them sooner, but at least at age 14. And the purpose of the secondary transition journey is to provide students with the skills they need to function as adults in their communities to the greatest extent and independently as possible. Not only do we need them to be actively participating, but the secondary planning process provides the students opportunities to learn or practice sharing their interests and preferences, needs. Practicing those self-advocacy skills is a key part of what this process really provides the student to communicate their needs and ideas. And also, it's an important step in the student's development to understand and be able to describe their disability and its impact, and also the needs that they have as far as supports and accommodations. So we know how critical it is to have students involved in this process. But there are some teams that have students that are reluctant or insecure or not sure how to be involved in this. The number one way we can make that happen and slowly bring them as part of this team is to make it relevant to them. Put it in real life terms. Doing so makes it easier for them to meaningfully participate, because we know how often we hear, "I don't know," as an answer to a question that we ask. That's okay. The secondary transition process is meant to be a time to discover what those answers may be. So starting with some key questions may be helpful for teams. Questions like, where do I want to live? Exploring those options. Maybe what they may not have considered. What kind of work do I want to do? Maybe pointing out what they have been successful at doing already and what their interests are. And if they do have an interest in something, or they voice an interest in an area, what kind of training do I need for that? Then, where do I want to live? And how much money per month do I need? What do I want to do for fun? Who do I need to help? Or what kind of supports will I need to be successful in doing that? And sometimes teams may consider or face a student that has maybe a goal that what is viewed as unrealistic or maybe inappropriate for that student. That's okay. As a team and family member, be supportive, but maybe consider saying things like, well, if that doesn't work out, what else could we do? Or specifically including the student in looking at those realistic aspects of what kind of training or schooling is required, and having them be part of the investigating and looking into and answering that question. The next critical member of this secondary transition planning process, of course, is the family. Parent membership or family membership on the IEP team and transition planning team is required by IDEA, as we talked about earlier, and it's also essential. When families stay involved in their middle school and high school students' education process, students are more likely to attend school regularly, have a positive attitude about school, earn higher grades, graduate from high school, and enroll in post-secondary learning, leading to successful outcomes after school. Family involvement is a greater predictor of success for youth than any income or social status may be. Research has shown that. We are talking of the time of transition. Family roles will change when a young person graduates from high school and reaches adulthood, but they do not end. the family will always be critical. So we understand that the family's voice is a critical one at the table when discussing secondary transition planning and how families participate. There's a few very practical ways in which the families can increase their effectiveness and their influence on the team. Sharing unique information about the student just as they have throughout the student's school career. Reinforcing skills being taught at school. Again, this is probably something that families have been doing all along, but it continues to be critically important in these transition planning years. Making connections with adult service providers. Understanding the secondary transition process and their role in it. And of course, setting and maintaining those high expectations, those living, learning, and working expectations that we discussed earlier, is something that families can do on an everyday basis. Here are some other examples of activities and ways in which families can support and assist their student in this development during these transition years. The items on the slide are steps that families have probably been doing for years, but secondary transition is a time when families can expand or build on what they've already been doing so their student can discover their own future and continue to increase those responsibility and independent skills. Youth need as much practice as possible to acquire those skills before they turn 18 to provide for, or to prepare for the future. Encouraging the self-acceptance, helping the student to understand, accept, and feel okay about his or her disability and the impact that it has, knowing his or her strengths and challenges, and exploring disability accommodations in the adult learning and working world. It's a good idea for families to include the student in those investigations or discoveries into those services as much as possible or appropriate for that student. Self-advocacy, we've talked about a few other times. Skills included the ability to make decisions, communicate their needs, and ask for what's necessary for them, and just communicating their interests and preferences. Self-determination is a belief that all individuals have the right to direct their own lives. To help students gain the skills to successfully direct their own futures, that's really what the transition planning process is all about. Families can give opportunities to make choices and accept the consequences of those choices. Encourage, model flexibility and being open to options and maybe different ways of doing things. Teach a method or strategy or problem-solving skills in everyday life can be absolutely invaluable to students. Help develop those social connections. Social outlooks for relationships and recreation are more than fun. They are truly the bridge to success and an aspect of adult life. They're important tools that help people be successful in the community and an overall increase their success and positive way of life. It provides a network of support for that student and encouraging the student involvement all along the way in all aspects, the living, learning, and working. Families can do this through activities like encouraging your teen to apply for jobs or volunteer work or job shadowing, service learning or summer projects, teaching the value of money to the extent that's appropriate for that youth, earn or given an allowance, or really encouraging just hobbies and pursuing their interests, all are important aspects and activities that families can do. Now let's take a look at another required member of that secondary transition planning team, and that's the school. IDEA requires that members of school staff be part of the student's IEP team and their transition planning process. Staff team members that are involved are chosen based on the needs of the student and if they are involved in that student's educational program. The school is responsible for providing opportunities for the student to take a variety of classes, participate in different work experience programs, or practice transportation possibly, taking tests to determine their interests and monitoring those skill levels are all important. They also provide a professional expertise by employing the teachers who are trained in the core academic areas. They are also trained in strategies of teaching students with disabilities, school psychologists, and AEA related staff. They are also responsible for providing resources to families. And that's an important aspect. So again, going back to our self-advocacy and effective advocacy skills, it's important for families to ask questions for understanding, or if they need assistance seeking out or where to begin for those adult services, to find those out and to see what supports might be available. And I just want to point out the diagram at the bottom. It's so important for parents, teachers, and students to continue that connection and communication throughout. The last group of people involved in this important transition planning process are what's referred to as others. Because this group of people can be individually determined based on the student's needs. The IEP process includes the input of these others, such as community and adult service providers. Some examples might be Iowa Vocational Rehabilitative Services, or IVRS, the Centers for Independent Living, and other advocacy or disability-specific organizations. Even if these providers don't actually attend the meetings, their inputs can be very helpful. Another subset of the group others are people with special expertise about the student, special knowledge of the impact of the disability, perhaps a doctor or a counselor outside of the school, a PT, OT, or speech therapist that have worked with the student and know some specific strategies or supports that have been successful, or some ideas of what might be beneficial for the student moving forward. All of these folks can bring resources and knowledge to the table that will be helpful for the team in making decisions. Now that we have identified who is on that team, let's take a closer look at the process in which that team will use to successfully plan. As we begin to look at the specific steps within this process, it can be helpful to keep in mind the analogy of planning for a road trip. First, you have to identify where you're starting out, your current location. Then you should identify your end destination. Then you plot out how you're going to get there. The secondary transition process is similar, starting at age 14, and the journey or the trip will vary depending on the student's age, grade, level of need, or accommodations. And it's important to involve that student every step along the way. So these questions are perfect opportunity to really engage the students using their voice in the planning process. So it's phrased from a, what's my current location? Where's the student functioning? So we'll talk about identifying strengths, needs, interests, and preferences. We know that we need to do this with data and through assessments. So if we continue with our analogy of a road trip, the IEP really serves as the map, and it identifies our starting point or our current location with the present level of academic achievement and functional performance. This is identified on each student's IEP at the beginning of each goal. It identifies where the student is currently. It's based on assessments and observations. It can be from school staff. It could possibly be from outside professionals or personnel that work and have specific or special knowledge of the student. It could be classroom or other types of tests or achievements. But basically, it just states where the student is functioning currently when you look at that goal or expectation. There is not just one assessment that provides a team with all the necessary data for making the decisions. And it could be assessments that looked different than a specific paper pencil test or standardized test. It could be collecting information or observations or work samples or descriptions of how the student functions in specific settings. All of those things can provide useful information to determine where the student is currently functioning or starting at their current level in the areas of living, learning, and working as it relates to their specific expectations that the team has identified. This is one example of what a team might use to plan out or to summarize their assessments being done in all three areas, living, learning, and working. As you can see, the assessments that the team is looking at, interests and preferences for each of those areas, the strengths of the student, the work, everyday soft skills for that area, as well as how this may apply to adult life and their post-secondary expectations for each of these areas. It's a good place to note that at the end or attached to this presentation is a resource of transition terms. Though many families have been involved in the IEP process and the special education world, where there are lots of different terminologies and acronyms, the transition stage brings a whole new set of terms and phrases or acronyms that are beneficial for families to be aware of. So we tried to put all of these together in a list that also will take you to resources that will go more in depth in each of those areas that are relevant to your student. So take a look for that. It's called Transition Terms at the end of this presentation, or it can be found on askresource.org under Resources. The team's next step after identifying the starting point or current level of functioning is determining the destination. In terms of the IEP, this is post-secondary expectations in all three areas, living, learning, and working. On the current IEP form, these expectations are noted and documented on the second page, or page B. Even if the student doesn't know specifically where or what they want to do in the future, it's important for the team to identify some long-term goals and identify those needs and steps that must be in place in order to get there. With the understanding, of course, that the expectations can and probably will change. It's important for the student and the team to start considering where we want to go. If we recall that post-secondary refers to after high school, these expectations are truly set for the plan for that student after leaving high school in the areas of living, learning, and working. I know I keep repeating those three areas, but they're important for everyone on the team to be very familiar with. These expectations are based on assessments and data that is collected, and it must be included on every student's IEP. Once the expectations are set and agreed upon, the team begins asking what services or goals, study courses, activities, supports, and services are necessary every year to move the student forward in accomplishing those expectations. These services are really the road to how the student is going to reach their destination. The course of study is also identified on each student's IEP. This is really the student's long-term learning plan. It relates directly to each of those post-secondary expectations we've been talking about. It also specifically states on the IEP when the student plans to graduate. These can be important conversations for the team to have so that everyone understands and is in agreement to when that student is planning to graduate. It lists required courses or activities and linkages that need to be made in order for that student to get closer to those expectations. We wouldn't want a student to get to their final year of high school and realize that they needed to take some math course in order to get into a program that they were hoping to, for instance. And it's important that the team reviews these at least annually, maybe more so. But during the secondary transition time, the team should look at every year the questions: what progress has this student made? What's been learned? What new skills have been learned and what new skills are being exhibited? And what still needs to be done in order for the student to reach the expectations that have been agreed upon and established. A student's IEP will continue to contain annual goals during the transition years. The difference being During transition planning, each annual goal must be related to a student's post-secondary expectation. Goals will continue to indicate at what level the student is currently and where the student is expected to be at the end of the IEP year. Goals will describe behaviors, activities, or skills in observable ways and measurable terms. It will talk about how the progress will be monitored and reported. It'll be specific and it'll guide instructions and activities that the student will participate in. Some of these goals will be academic, such as improving reading, for instance, so that the student may attend a community college to pursue a desired career. Or it could be more building those lifelong skills, such as learning to do online banking or becoming aware of personal safety and signs in the community, cooking meals, or making doctor's appointments. Some students may need to be taught social skills in a structured way, role modeling social stories or repeated practice to master those important social skills that will be expected in adult settings. Along with course of study and annual goals, the services and supports are important for helping a student move from where they are to where they hope to be at the end of secondary transition. The IEP team will determine what services, supports, and linkages are necessary to achieve the student's goals or in some other ways support their progress towards those post-secondary expectations. It's a very important section of the IEP. Currently, it is listed as page F, or maybe referred to as the services page. It states exactly what will be provided for a student, who's responsible for providing it, when, where, and for how long the service or support will be provided. These services might include instruction, which could happen in a variety of settings, related services, which could include assistive technology or some of the other related services, community participation, which could include after-school jobs or activities, using the public library, maybe practicing reading a bus schedule or community recreation activities, developing employment and other post-school goals. It could be a partnership with a work experience program, writing a resume, practicing interviews, or money management. This might be a good place in which a team could consider including Iowa Vocational Rehabilitative Services, or IVRS, if they aren't already involved in the student's plan. Supports to give the student access to education and other opportunities. Also, supports for the school personnel on behalf of the student is part of these services that can be provided. It could be time for consultation and joint planning between teachers or other professionals. And lastly, it can include linkages to other service providers. Like I said before, IVRS or some disability services at a college that a student might be considering attending. Really, it's just including connections and maybe just introductions to services a student might need now or in the future for their adult living. As we wrap up our discussion of the transition planning process, it's important to remember it's just that, a process. It's a journey, a work in progress, not just completing one document or checklist or not just one or two meetings, but it's something that the family, as well as the educators and IEP team members, have to continually revisit and keep in mind. Throughout this process, it's important for families to continue understanding their rights and responsibilities. Many of these are the same as they have been throughout the school career of the student, but the transition years bring some additional rights and responsibility changes, especially as the student approaches graduation and age 18. The role of the family does not end, but it does begin to shift and change. Using the effective advocacy skills, however, is still critical. Decisions should be based on complete information, so asking questions is an effective way to gather information and to really understand what these new terms and what the services can provide. Understanding the key players, not just those that have been on the team in the past, but those new ones that may need to be invited or included, specifically from the community or adult services. And sometimes disagreements or conflicts can't always be resolved within the IEP team. So, special education dispute resolution options, it's important to remember those and to keep the process moving to get it back on track for the student's best interest, moving them towards those expectations. Finally, it's important to remember that no one has to do this alone. There are lots of ways to find resources and supports in the community, and even connecting with other families can be very beneficial to learning about supports that are available. Here's a list of 3 useful resources for you to refer to later. There will be links to each of these at the end of the presentation. We talked a little bit about the transition terms, which defines and gives further resources to look at as far as understanding new transition-related terms or acronyms. The second is a post-secondary summary, which is a summary of the supports and services provided to a student during high school by their IEP team. And lastly is a graduation guidance for families. This is a document explaining the graduation requirements provided by the Iowa Department of Education. In addition to those listed on the previous slide, these resources will link families and teams to additional valuable information and tools to use during the transition planning process. Just as each student is individual and their needs are so, is each team's need individual for the information and resources that they require. I encourage you to do a little searching, investigating, and just checking out some of these other resources. Thank you for listening to this presentation of the secondary transition planning process, The Road to Discovery. Please take a minute and check out some of the links and references and resources for additional information and more details regarding the topics that we've discussed here today. If you have any follow-up questions or would like additional information, please visit askresource.org. There's a Contact Us button, or go to the Resources section and check out under Transition. Transition Iowa is also a great resource for all things secondary transition related. Thanks again, and I wish you the best of luck on your secondary transition planning journey.